Hello everyone, I am Demented Kirby, and welcome to my channel, the Commander Tavern. The Commander Tavern is a channel dedicated to my favorite Magic the Gathering format. The Stage is a series on this channel where games are played in the Commander Tavern for your entertainment. This episode of The Stage is a special episode played long distance via cockatrice. Due to the coronavirus outbreak, almost the entire world has been quarantined, so meeting up to play will be a trifle difficult to say the least. I was once more joined by Hamster from Space and Shadowland from EDHsilver.com, as well as Georgios, a patron of the Commander Tavern. Also, this episode is a double header. It's two back-to-back EDH games between a Sliv-Mizzet Hive Mind combo deck piloted by Hamster from Space, a Louvaq the Aberrant Green-Blue Good Stuff deck piloted by yours truly, a Slivdrazi Monstrosity Sliver Tribal deck piloted by Shadowland, and a Vazal the Complete combo deck piloted by Georgios. If you like any of the cards played throughout the video, please consider using my TCG Player affiliate link when purchasing those cards. You can find that link down in the description. It'll really help out the channel. Other ways you can help support the channel is with my Patreon. Patrons get early access to scheduled videos on YouTube, and higher tier patrons get access to a VIP section of my Discord server. You can find a link to that down in the description too. In fact, patrons got a chance to see this video earlier. Alright, let's get back to the episode. Hamster keeps an opening hand of 2 islands, Frenetic Sliver, Tandem Lookout, Magma Sliver, Kindred Charge, and Command Tower. I keep an opening hand of 2 forests, Pithing Needle, Birds of Paradise, Witchbane Orb, Heroic Intervention, and Tooth and Nail. Shadowland keeps an opening hand of Tainted Isle, Decimate, Plateau, Cascading Cataracts, Ashes to Ashes, Mana Crypt, and Necrotic Sliver. Georgios keeps an opening hand of 2 forests, Veil of Summer, Walking Ballista, Scribe Ranger, Elvish Archdruid, and Akroma's Memorial. Hamster wins the die roll and starts us off. Hamster draws a card, plays an island, then passes. I draw a card, play a forest, then cast Birds of Paradise. I pass. Shadowland draws a card, plays a Tainted Isle, then passes. Georgios draws a card, plays a snow-covered forest, then passes. Hamster draws a card, plays Command Tower, then casts Lightning Greaves. He passes. I untap, then draw a card. I play a forest and then pass. Shadowland draws a card, plays a Plateau, then passes. Georgios draws a card, plays a forest, then passes. Hamster untaps, then draws a card. He plays a mountain. He casts Pillar of Origins, naming Sliver, although he could have just as easily named Bushrag. He then passes. I draw a card, then play Prismatic Vista. I immediately crack it to fetch for an island. The tropical island there is a mistake. I then cast my commander and pass my turn. At the end of my turn, Louvaq gives itself a +1/+1 counter. Shadowland draws a card, then plays Cascading Cataracts. He passes. At the end of his turn, Georgios flashes in Scribe Ranger. He untaps, then draws a card. He plays a snow-covered forest, then taps out to cast Basalt Monolith. He then passes. Since this fairy has protection from blue, I can't target it with Louvaq. Hamster untaps, then draws a card. He plays an island. He then casts Tandem Lookout. He equips Lightning Greaves to it. He then passes. Since it has Shroud, Louvaq can't give it a +1/+1 counter either. I untap, then draw a card. I play Gaia's Cradle. I then cast Pithing Needle, profusely apologizing to Georgios because he was going to undoubtedly cast his commander his upcoming turn. But Vazal is dangerous, so I had to name it as Pithing Needle enters the battlefield. I then enter combat, swinging Louvaq at Georgios. He blocks with Scribe Ranger. I end my turn, putting a +1/+1 counter on Birds of Paradise. Shadowland draws a card, then plays Yavimaya Hollow. He casts Mana Crypt. He activates Cascading Cataracts for 5 green, casting Seedborn Muse with it. At the end of his turn, Louvaq gives it a +1/+1 counter. Georgios and Shadowland untap, then Georgios draws a card. Georgios plays a snow-covered forest. He then taps out to cast Akroma's Memorial. He then attacks me with Scribe Ranger, which I block with my birds, killing the fairy. He then passes. Hamster untaps, then draws a card. He plays a mountain, then taps out to cast his commander. In response, I hard cast Force of Will. He then passes. I untap, then draw a card. I enter combat, attacking Shadowland with Louvaq. In response, he casts Anguish Unmaking, targeting Louvaq. I respond by casting Heroic Intervention. He then takes 4 commander damage. I cast Sky Shroud Claim in my second main phase, ramping for an untapped Breeding Pool and Dryad Arbor. At the end of my turn, Louvaq puts a +1/+1 counter on Dryad Arbor. Shadowland untaps, loses 3 life to Mana Crypt, then draws a card. He plays Tainted Field. He then taps out to cast his commander. He then enters combat, attacking Georgios with Seedborn Muse, dealing him 3 combat damage. He then passes. At the end of his turn, Louvaq puts a +1/+1 counter on Slivdrazi Monstrosity. Georgios and Shadowland untap, then Georgios draws a card. He casts Soul Ring. He then casts Elvish Archdruid. He then passes. At the end of his turn, Shadowland creates 2 Eldrazi Sliver tokens. Hamster and Shadowland untap, then Hamster draws a card. He plays Prismatic Vista, immediately cracking it for a mountain. He then casts Herald's Horn, naming Sliver as it enters the battlefield, although he could have very easily named Camerid, Hippo, or even Citizen. He then casts Magma Sliver, choosing not to soulbound it. He then passes. At the end of his turn, Louvaq puts a +1/+1 counter on Magma Sliver, and Shadowland creates 2 more Eldrazi Sliver tokens. I begin my turn, untapping along with Shadowland, and then drawing a card. I cast an Entwined Tooth and Nail. I cheat in Seedborn Muse and Gilded Drake. When Gilded Drake enters the battlefield, I swap it for Shadowland's Slivdrazi Monstrosity. In response, he creates 2 more Eldrazi Sliver tokens. I then enter combat, swinging Louvaq at Hamster. He can't block it, so he takes 4 commander damage. At the end of his turn, I put a +1/+1 counter on Slivdrazi. I then pass. Both Shadowland and I untap. He loses no life to Mana Crypt and then draws a card. He plays a Reflecting Pool. He activates Cascading Cataracts, casting Necrotic Sliver. With his remaining mana, he sacrifices an Eldrazi Sliver token to destroy Slivdrazi Monstrosity. I respond by creating 2 Eldrazi Slivers. I then sacrifice a Sliver token to destroy Necrotic Sliver. In response, Shadowland sacrifices 2 tokens for mana and taps out, sacrificing Necrotic Sliver to destroy my Seedborn Muse. I respond by sacrificing the token for mana, then sacrificing Slivdrazi to destroy Shadowland's own Seedborn Muse. He then enters combat, swinging at me with Gilded Drake, dealing 3 combat damage. He then passes. At the end of his turn, I bargain to put a +1/+1 counter on his Gilded Drake if he no longer swings at me with it. He agrees. Georgios pays 3 to untap Basalt Monolith. He then starts his turn. Only Georgios untaps this time. He draws a card and then casts Citadel Flute. He then passes. At the end of his turn, Louvaq gives Elvish Archdruid a +1/+1 counter. Hamster untaps but doesn't reveal a sliver in his upkeep. He then draws a card. He then taps out to recast his commander. He soul bonds it to Tandem Lookout when it enters the battlefield. He then equips Sliv-Mizzet with Lightning Greaves. Now having assembled his combo, he tries to win the game. He taps Sliv-Mizzet to deal 1 damage to Shadowland. In response, Georgios casts Veil of Summer. In response, Hamster taps Magma Silver to reinitiate the combo. In response, Georgios activates Citadel Flute for X=4, searching up Phyrexian Ironfoot just to show some of the interactions he has in his deck. Afterwards, Magma Sliver's effect resolves, drawing Hamster a card and triggering Sliv-Mizzet and Magma Sliver, dealing 2 damage to Georgios. This triggers Sliv-Mizzet's Soul Bond ability, untapping it. He then reinitiates the infinite combo before allowing Veil of Summer to resolve, dealing enough damage to the rest of the table to win the game. For those wondering how Hamster won, let's just quickly see how the combo works. Sliv-Mizzet deals 1 damage to any target whenever you draw a card, but since it's soul bonded to Tandem Lookout, you draw a card whenever it deals damage. This creates a loop. Since Magma Sliver is also dealing 1 damage every time he draws a card, he's dealing 2 damage every time he draws a card. That means that he's able to kill the table before decking himself. Since he was able to reinitiate this combo before Veil of Summer resolved, Georgios didn't have hexproof throughout the combo and was able to be targeted by Hamster's slivers. I was fortunate enough to have been able to keep Vazal at bay and managed to deplete most of Shadowland's resources as well as countering Sliv-Mizzet the first time. But I wasn't able to keep the entire table at bay for the whole match, and Hamster quickly took the game right out from under us. This shows just how powerful these commanders are. Just when Hamster seemed to be behind in the game, he just wins out of nowhere with his infinite combo. Alright, on to game 2. Shadowland keeps an opening hand of Yamavaya Hollow, Clot Sliver, Skull Clamp, Mana Crypt, Crypt Sliver, Torment of Hailfire, and a Brushland. Georgios keeps an opening hand of 2 Snow-Covered Forests, Shaman of Forgotten Ways, Gemstone Array, Patron of the Orochi, Sylvan Savekeeper, and Arbor Elf. Hamster keeps an opening hand of Negate, Battle Sliver, Force of Negation, Mutavault, Cavern of Souls, Scuttling Silver, and Fury Silver. I keep an opening hand of 2 Forests, Beast Whisperer, Nature's Lore, Command Tower, Cultivate, and Sky Shroud Claim. Shadowland wins the die roll and starts us off. Shadowland draws a card, then plays Brushland, tapping it to cast Skull Clamp. He then passes. Georgios draws a card, then plays a Snow-Covered Forest, tapping it to cast Arbor Elf. He then passes. Hamster draws a card, then plays Cavern of Souls, naming Sliver to no one's surprise. He then passes. I draw a card, play Command Tower, and then pass. Shadowland untaps, draws a card, plays Yavimaya Hollow, then passes. Georgios untaps, then draws a card. He plays a snow-covered forest, then taps out to cast Shaman of Forgotten Ways. He then passes. Hamster draws a card, then plays Mutavault. He taps out to cast Talisman of Creativity, and then passes. I untap, then draw a card. I play a forest, and then tap out to cast Nature's Lure, putting a tapped Breeding Pool onto the battlefield. I then pass. Shadowland draws a card, then plays an Underground Sea. He casts Clot Sliver. He then immediately equips Sculpt Clamp to it to draw 2 cards. He then passes. Georgios untaps, then draws a card. He plays a snow-covered forest. He casts Thousand Year Elixir. He activates Arbor Elf to be able to cast Sylvan Safekeeper. He then passes. Hamster untaps, then draws a card. He taps out to cast Scuttling Sliver. He then passes. I untap, then draw a card. I play a forest, and then tap out to cast Skyshroud Claim, putting Dryad Arbor and Tropical Island onto the battlefield. I then pass. Shadowland untaps, then draws a card. He casts Crypt Sliver. He then casts Mana Crypt. He equips Sculpt Clamp to Crypt Sliver to draw 2 cards. He then plays his own Cavern of Souls, naming Bushwhack before coming to his senses and actually naming Sliver, to no one's surprise. He then casts Mind Lash Sliver, immediately equipping Sculpt Clamp to it in order to draw 2 cards. He ends his turn, discarding down to maximum hand size. Georgios untaps, then draws a card. He plays a snow-covered forest. He taps his Shaman for 2 green mana. He then untaps it with the Elixir to get 2 more green mana. He then completely taps out to be able to cast Patron of the Orochi. Thanks to the Elixir, he can tap it as if it had haste, so he does, untapping all of his green creatures and forests. His Patron should be untapped as well, that's a mistake. He's now able to cast his commander and does. He then passes. Hamster untaps, then draws a card. He casts Blur Sliver. In response, Georgios activates Vazal using Patron's ability, untapping all of his green creatures and forests. He taps all of his forests and activates Arbor Elf to tap down another forest to add 5 green mana to his mana pool. He then activates Patron to untap all of his green creatures and forests. He once more adds 5 green mana as before. He then activates Vazal using Arbor Elf's ability to untap a forest and add the 11th mana needed to activate Shaman of Forgotten Ways. This puts Shadowland at 0 life, while Hamster and I drop down to 1 life, and Georgios drops to 5 life. Blur Sliver finally resolves and enters the battlefield. He then enters combat, sending both slivers to Georgios, who can only block 1 and takes 2 combat damage. He then passes. I untap, then draw a card. I play a forest and then tap out to cast Avenger of Zendikar, getting some chump blockers to try and survive next turn. I should have made 7 plant tokens instead of the 6 you see here. That was an incredibly costly mistake. I then passed. Georgios untaps, then draws a card. He plays Deserted Temple. He then taps out to cast Finale of Devastation for X equals 12. In response, Hamster casts a free Force of Negation, countering it. Georgios then enters combat, sending Vazal to me and the Shaman to Hamster. I block Vazal with the Avenger and 2 plant tokens. Hamster dies to combat damage, as does my blockers. He then passes. I untap, and at the beginning of my upkeep, Georgios activates Patron, untapping all of his green creatures and forests. I then draw a card. I play an island. I then pass. Georgios untaps, then draws a card. He casts Scavenging Ooze. He exiles both graveyards with Vazal, gaining 2 life and putting 2 +1/+1 counters on it. He then enters combat, swinging at me with just Vazal. I flash in Stun Double as a copy of Vazal, and then flash in Frilled Mystic. I then block Vazal with these, and all 3 creatures die. He then activates Patron, untapping all of his green creatures and forests. He then taps out to recast his commander. He then activates Vazal to untap all of his forests and green creatures. He then casts Gemstone Array. He passes. I untap, then draw a card. I cast Beast Whisperer. I then cast my commander, drawing a card off of Beast Whisperer. I then pass. In response, Georgios puts 2 counters on Gemstone Array. Georgios untaps, then draws a card. He casts Retrofritter Foundry. He activates Vazal to exile my graveyard to gain 2 more life and put 2 +1/+1 counters on Vazal. He then enters combat with more than enough combat damage to kill me. However, as payback for having used Pithing Needle so early on him in the previous game, he responds to blockers by going through all the stages of Retrofritter Foundry, creating a servo token, then sacrificing it for a Thopter token, then sacrificing that to create a construct token. Finally passing to the damage step, I die to combat damage. This was yet another quick game showing just how powerful these Mystery Booster test cards legends are. Looking back at the footage, I realized my mistake of making one less plant token. Honestly, that would have made all the difference in the outcome of that match. Unfortunately, I didn't count Dryad Arbor as a land for Avenger of Zendikar to produce the 7 tokens it should have. Next turn, I would have cast Deadeye Navigator and had enough mana to blink the Avenger. Hopefully my little snafu shows just how important it is to pay attention to everything in a game. Being at 1 life made me too anxious and I wasn't focused as I should have been. Georgios was a force to be reckoned with using Vazal. Being able to activate Shaman of Forgotten Waste so early in the game was definitely critical to his success. Even though these games were pretty short, which was to be expected, we had a ton of fun playing and hope you had fun watching. I would like to once more thank Shadowland and Hamster from Space for joining me in this game. If you haven't already, you should definitely check out their website if you enjoy silver bordered cards. You can find a link to that as well as their Discord server in the description. I would also like to thank one of my higher tier patrons, Georgios, for once again appearing on the stage. If any other fan of the Commander Tavern would like to play online with me, just join my Discord server and we can try and coordinate a game. The link to my Discord server is in the description too. I would like to thank all my patrons for supporting me, and a quick shout out to all my higher tier patrons, the Brewers, for their patronage. I also want to thank anyone using my TCG Player affiliate link. It also helps out the channel. And to everyone, thanks for watching this episode of The Stage on the Commander Tavern. I am Demented Kirby, and happy playing.